One of our core beliefs is that the best salesperson is the one that asks the best questions. And I think most people, if they're in sales or a business owner, they certainly want to be the best salesperson. And I think what we often fall into is trying to think about the best way to describe our product or talk about our product, and we think that if we can sort of figure out the right mixture of things to say there, that and the right charm and the right personality traits, that we might find a way to become the best salesperson. But I believe that the key to that is just asking good questions. And I'm gonna make my case to you with a few slides of why I believe that. But before I do that, I actually want to just kind of share with you where that thought comes from. And yes, I'm with a company called Salescriptor, and we provide training and tools around asking good questions, and you're going to see a lot of that here today. So certainly that's part of our product and service. But where this comes from for me personally, it is that it actually goes to the first real sales job that I had, where I was selling software, and I worked in sort of an inside sales role, and was on the phone doing warm calls, cold calls, and I would get a prospect on the phone, and I would have what I would think was a good conversation, and then right when it would end, I'd go into my manager's office all excited to talk about it. And I guess the conversation was maybe okay, but when telling my manager about it, he would say, well, do they have budget to spend? And I would sit there realizing I didn't ask that. I didn't ask do they have budget to spend, and I would feel like, well, that was a good question. That would have been a good question to ask, and I didn't ask it. And I would kind of walk out of the office with my tail between my legs, realizing, well, maybe it wasn't such a great, maybe it's not such a great lead because I don't know if they have money to spend. And then that process would happen again, where I'd have another call, and I'd go run into my manager's office telling him about the lead I created, and he would ask me, well, are they the decision maker, the person you're talking to? And I would realize, well, I didn't really ask that, and then I would leave again. And so going through that process, I realized a couple things. One is I wasn't asking the right questions. Also, why was my manager not, he obviously knew the questions I needed to ask, because he would come in, he would tell them to me or press me on them, after the fact. Why didn't he just teach me about the right questions to ask? And the other thing I realized after going through this and really learning through trial and error, which by the way is extremely expensive in terms of lost opportunities and the amount of time it takes, but I realized that it's pretty easy to create a list of the questions that you need to ask. It doesn't take up a lot of space. It doesn't on a piece of paper. It doesn't take up a lot of space in your brain. And so that's what I started to do on my own. And I actually ended up creating a spreadsheet of questions that I needed to ask in different situations. And this was 15 years ago. And I actually ended up sharing that spreadsheet with my peers on my team, and it was actually kind of exciting when they would come to me and ask for the latest version of the spreadsheet. Now that I look back, that's technically probably the first version of Salescriptor. It's not really a straight line from that to me creating Salescriptor, but that's where all this comes from. Let me explain to you why I think that asking good questions is so important or helpful to you. And one is that if you ask good questions, you're going to make a good impression with your prospect because it's a little bit more professional. Think about the salesperson that talks about their product, and then the other person who asks good questions, thought-provoking questions. It will make you appear more sophisticated, even if you're not. A little side note: one of the first companies I started was a cold call outsourcing business where I hired work-at-home agents to do cold calling. And one trick that I used was I would teach them what questions to ask, and because it's real easy to teach someone a few questions to ask versus teaching someone how to explain something in detail. And these work-at-home agents would make a really good impression because they would sound really sophisticated because they were asking good questions. So it's one way to start out on the right foot with your prospect. The other thing about asking questions, and especially if we're replacing you just showing up and throwing up and talking about your product, If you replace that with asking questions instead, well, you're going to extract valuable information from the prospect. You're going to get them talking, and every question you ask, if they're decent questions, you should end up with more information, and that should help you in all sorts of ways. Questions are a great way to start conversations, whether you're making cold calls, whether you're talking to someone at a networking event. Instead of just talking about you and your company, if you ask questions, it's a good way to start conversations. And probably the best setting to explain that is when you're cold calling. I've received a lot of cold calls from salespeople, and they want to talk to me about their product. Well, instead of them talking at me, really, you can ask questions, and that gets me talking, and it stands more to get someone engaged. It can also keep a conversation going. So, okay, I just explain how it starts conversations, but a lot of things that a prospect will do to try to end the conversation, especially when phone prospecting, is they're going to throw an objection at you. One of the best ways to respond to objections is by asking a question. A prospect says, "Oh, I'm not interested." Well, instead of just trying to talk about your product to make them interested, ask them a question. Oh, I understand. If I could ask you real quick, have you ever been challenged by this? It also makes the conversation more about the prospect. Salespeople can tend to be, very all about them. They have a very product-centric sales pitch. It's, this is the company I work for. This is what we sell. I want to talk to you about this. Well, if you replace that with asking good questions, you make the conversation more about the prospect. And maybe put yourself in a situation where you went to lunch with someone and all they did was talk about themselves, right? And you just sat there. You might be kind of bored. Well, now replace that with going to lunch with someone who asked you a lot of questions about you and about your hobbies and your interests and where you've traveled, and you did a lot of the talking, and they made it all about you. You probably found that to be a more engaging, actually, you probably didn't think about it being engaging because but you probably thought about it being a more delightful conversation. A more interesting conversation is the right word, because what we like talking about in most cases, is the stuff we're interested in. And so make it more about the prospect, and that's what questions will help you to do. I mean, you may agree, okay, yeah, I need to make it more about the other person and not so much about my product. Well, how do I do that? Well, the how is ask questions. Also, you hear this phrase about consultative selling, and I think that even a lot of people that talk about consultative selling don't truly do consultative selling. Like, they might sell a technical product and they say, well, it's a consultative sale, but they still have a product pitch where they talk about the service or product. To really do more consultative selling, it starts with asking good questions. Picture what a consultant does, when they're in an engagement. They're asking questions. So if you want to be a consultative salesperson, which I basically also think there's a lot of real benefits to that, start with asking good questions. If you do all those things that I just kind of went through, you make a good impression. You make it more about the prospect. You have more of a consultative approach. What's going to happen is you're going to end up building more rapport and trust with the prospect. They're less likely to feel like you're a pushy, annoying salesperson, and more feel like you're an advisor and a consultative person that might represent a product that they ultimately want to sell, but they'll feel more comfortable with you. They'll feel like because you're asking questions, they'll feel more trust with you, that if you were to propose something and give them pricing and a proposal, that because you've asked good questions and you haven't really been pushing your product the whole time, that they should be able to trust you as a trusted advisor. And those are some of the reasons why I believe that the best salesperson is the one that asks the best questions. And here's the trick, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, which is you can agree with all that, but you still could be a little lost with saying, okay, I need to ask more questions, but I don't know what questions to ask. And you're absolutely right. It's not that easy just to say, okay, I'm going to ask more questions today, but you just don't say it. You need to have some sort of direction or some sort of logic with what to ask. And basically, we're going to show you that here today.